Hi, I'm Laura McCabe. Thanks for joining me here today at Beaducation for my new class called Bag It, which is a beaded leather pouch you can use for any of your jewelry. In today's class, we're going to talk about the basics of leather working, bead embroidery on leather, and general assembly of the pouch. First, we're going to talk about tools that you'll need for this project. There's some basic tools you want to have on hand. The first is a small pair of embroidery scissors that are great for cutting the threads very close to the beadwork. The second is some E6000 adhesive. We'll use this to glue the different layers of leather together. The next is a few toothpicks. These are used to spread the E6000 over the leather. Then you'll also want a triangle tray for picking up your beads. You'll also need to have a good pair of sharp sewing shears. I'd recommend using titanium shears, as glue and sticky adhesive does not stick to titanium shears. In addition to these, you'll also need some microcrystalline wax or beeswax to condition your thread and avoid knotting. In addition to the tools we've already covered, you'll need 3 types of needles to do this project. The first is basic beading needles. I'm using a size 12, but if you're more comfortable with a size 10, you can also use that for this project. In addition to the basic beading needles, you'll also need glover's needles, which are special for leather working. Glover's needles come in a variety of sizes, including size 10 and size 12. And just like with beading needles, the larger the size, the thinner the needle. So a size 12 glover's needle will be thinner than a size 10 glover's needle. Glover's needles are different than other needles because they have a sharp 3-sided barb at the end. This is excellent for piercing leather, but it also works well for piercing fingers, so you're going to need to be very careful when using glover's needles. You may even want to use a thimble to protect your finger. We're ready to talk about the leather you're going to need for this project. When you're using leather, you want to make sure it's very soft and it's a split hide, which means the hide has actually been split in half to make thinner leather. It's important to have something that's supple and easy to work with. If you're working with a heavier weight cowhide, you're going to find it very difficult to stitch through. In this case, we're going to use a waxed cowhide, which is again a split hide and very thin and easy to sew. For the lining, we're going to use a goatskin suede. Again, as with the leather for the outside of the pouch, you're going to want to make sure that your suede is thin and easy to sew through. Ultra suede also makes an excellent lining for the pouch and is much easier to sew through than any type of leather. In addition to these 2 types of leather, you're also going to need a piece of leather thong for tying the pouch once you've finished it. Here are the beads you're going to need for this project. You're going to need 5 colors of size 11 seed beads. You're also going to need 1 color of size 11s. In addition to the seed beads, you're going to want a 6mm lentil bead. You can also substitute a 6mm nail head or any sort of 6mm flattened bead, including a pearl. In addition to these crystals, you're going to want crystal sequins as well. The crystal sequins come in both 4 and 3mm, and it's nice to have an assortment of both sizes. Finally, we're going to talk about the different threads you're going to need for this project. You're going to need fireline for stitching down the sequins and the beads to the leather. We're using fireline because the crystal is quite sharp, and by using fireline, you're less likely to have breakage. You can use either the clear or the smoke-colored fireline, depending on the color of your beads. Light color beads work better with the crystal or the clear, and darker beads work better with the smoke, which is a gray color. In addition to the fireline, you're also going to need some sort of nylon thread. This is 1G. You can also use Nymo or Ceylon. You're going to want to pick a color that matches your leather fairly well. This is going to be used to do any sort of stitching other than the bead stitching on the pouch. We're ready to talk about transferring the pattern to the leather. In your directions, you'll find a basic template for your leather pouch. Cut out your template and hold it in place as you trace around the edge with a ballpoint pen. If you'd like to make a more permanent template, you can always transfer this paper template to a piece of cardboard. It'll hold up better over time. Make sure when you trace the template that you're tracing it on the wrong side of the leather. If you trace it on the other side, you may see some of the pen marks even after you've cut the edge off. Should you decide to make your own pattern, you can always use a piece of paper as your basic template. You can cut it a couple of times until you get the right shape and size. Once you've traced the overall template, this is going to be the back side of the pouch, and here's the flap. You're ready to trace the piece which will be the front part of the pouch. Fold the flap under along the dotted line, and you're ready to transfer the front part of the pouch. Hold it in place, and just as before, trace around the edge. Here's your basic pattern transferred to the leather. Now we're ready to cut out our pattern pieces. Using a sharp pair of sewing scissors, you're going to want to cut along the lines that you've drawn on the leather. Take your time and cut this out slowly. The primary embellishment for this pouch is done on the back side. It's comprised of both bead embroidered flowers and also crystal sequins, which are sewn on afterwards. First, we're going to do the flowers. To do the bead embroidered flowers, you're going to need all 5 colors of your 15s, as well as the 1 color of size 11s. And you're also going to need the lentil beads, which are going to be used as the center of the flower. We're ready to start beading. I want to begin by showing you how to tie a knot in your thread. String up about 2 feet worth of single threaded fire line, and then we're ready to make a knot at the end. For purposes of demonstration, we're going to use white fire line. I would normally use the gray smoke color for this project given the colors of the beads I'm using, but the white's going to be much easier for you to see in the demonstrations. Begin by making a circle of the thread. Begin to feed the tail up through the hole, but don't pull it all the way through. You'll want to make a loop, which is a slip knot. Then feed the tail of the thread through your loop and pull the knot down tight. This is going to make a slightly larger knot than you would normally make with a basic sewing knot, and it will keep the thread from pulling through the leather when you first start out. Now you're going to want to cut the tail off your fire line. Leave about 1/4 inch of thread beyond the knot. Using your size 12 beading needle, we're going to begin our stitching. Flowers are placed randomly on the pouch, and you can decide how you want to lay them out. Begin by coming up through the leather. You're going to want to make sure that you leave some space between the edge and your flower. Come up through the leather from the back side and pick up one of the 6mm lentil beads. As I mentioned before, you can also use a 6mm nail head or any 6mm flattened bead. Pull the needle through the bead and hold the bead flat against the fabric. Go back down through the leather on the other side of the bead. You'll notice on this, there's a front side, which you can see here, and a back side with the foiling. You can turn it either way, although I usually do it with the front side showing. With the nail head, there's a faceted side and a flat side. You'll always want to use a nail head with the faceted side up. We're now going to reinforce this bead a couple of times because it is crystal and it is sharp. Come back up where you began. Go back through the bead again. Go down through the leather. Now we're going to stitch through a third time. Again, come up through the leather, go through the bead, and down through the leather again. You now have 3 threads running through this lentil bead, which will help to keep it in place and will also ensure that the crystal will not cut through your threads. We're ready to begin the beading for the flower. Again, come back up where you started and go back through the bead one more time. This is going to be your 4th pass. Pick up 3 seed beads. I usually do an A, B, A color pattern. Here you can see I've chosen a lighter green and a root beer color. The lighter green is the A, the root beer is the B. So again, an A, B, A color pattern. Go back down through the bead again to create a picot out of the 3/15s you've just picked up. Now do a picot on the other side. Again with the ABA color pattern. And go back through the bead. You now have a picot on either side of the bead. What you want to do now is pass through all 3 beads in this original picot. Now we need to fill in the space between the 2 picots. We want to continue our striped color pattern. Having used an A bead here, we're going to start by picking up a B bead. We're going to need to pick up 7 size 15s in a B, A, B, A, B, A, B color pattern. Once you have your 7 beads on, slide them down into place, wrap them around the bead, and go through the 3 beads in the other picot. Now we're ready to fill in the second side. Again, we're going to do a B, A, B, A, B, A, B color pattern. Slide your 7 beads down. And we're going to go back into the first picot. Although this time, we're just going to go through 2 of the beads, so you're coming out the tip bead in the picot. Now we're ready to start peyote stitching. I usually switch over to a 3rd color, a C color, size 15 for this part. Pick up 1 15, skip over the A colored bead, and go through the B colored bead. By using the A and B color beads in the initial circle, you'll always be going through a B colored bead in this second round. It makes it really easy to see where you're going without having to worry too much about the peyote stitch pattern. Again, pick up a C-colored bead, go through the next B-colored bead. When you get up to the picot, you're going to treat it just as the rest of the circle. Everything will fall into place. Pick up a C-colored bead and go just through that tip bead in the picot. Continue around on the second side of the flower. You may see a little thread showing between your beads as you work, but don't worry about that. This will resolve itself as we continue to work out on the flower. Once we get back to the original picot where we started, you're going to go through the tip bead in the picot and then step up through that C-color bead, which was the first C-color bead you added. To begin your petals, start out by picking up 115, 111, and then 3 more 15s in a different color. Slide your beads into place, and now turn around and go back through the 11 which you've just added. This will make a picot out of those 3 15s here at the end. Now pick up 1 more 15 and go through the next C-colored bead around the flower. You'll notice at this point that your petals are unattached to the leather. We're going to go back and stitch them down once we've finished all the petals. To review, pick up 115, 111, and 3 more 15s in a different color. Slide your beads into place, and now turn around and go back through that 11 you just added. Pick up another 15 and go through the next C-colored bead around the flower. This will create a second petal. You're going to want to continue in this manner all the way around the flower until you have a total of 10 petals. Now that we've finished all the petals, we're ready to stitch them down. What you want to do is work your way up so you're coming out of the tip of the next petal picot. That means you're going to have to go through 2 of the 3 beads in this picot. 1 and 2. And now you can see we're coming out of that top bead. What you're going to want to do is go down into the leather right next to the bead. On this first petal, because it's only attached on one side right now, you're going to want to come up again on the other side just to securely attach the tip. Go back down through the leather. And now we're going to skip over to the next petal tip. Come up through the leather, go through that tip bead, and go back down through the leather again. Skip over to the third petal, come up through the leather, go through the tip bead and the picot, and back down into the leather. When you look at the back side, you're going to see the stitches between the picots, but this doesn't matter because in the end we're going to end up lining this pouch and you won't see any of this stitch work. You're going to want to continue in this manner until you've gotten all the petals stitched down. Once you've stitched down the tips of all your petals, your flower will be very secure in place. Go back through the leather to the back side and tie off with a basic double half hitch. Catch the thread and then go through the loop that you've made. Again, repeat this a second time to secure the knot. I usually start with a new thread for each of the flowers because they tend to be scattered throughout the pouch. Once you've tied off, you're ready to go in and snip your thread, leaving about a 1/4 inch tail. Let's talk about placement of flowers on the back side of the pouch. I usually place them randomly and will usually do an odd number of flowers because aesthetically odd numbers are more pleasing. You can see on this pouch I've done 5 flowers on the back side. Normally I'll apply all my flowers before I begin embellishing with sequins. It helps to define the general path for the sequins. Again, this is done free-form without a pattern. For demonstration purposes, I'm going to start the sequins right away on my other pouch, just so you can see the process used. For attaching sequins, you're going to want to use a double thread. The sequins, like the lentil beads, are crystal, so they're quite sharp. Using a double thread can help ensure that the thread won't break and the crystals won't fall off. With your thread, make a loop and pull your tails through. Then cut your thread about a 1/4 inch below the knot. To attach the sequins, come up from the back side of the leather. Remember, sequins have holes through the center, so you're going to need to leave a little bit of space around where you come up through the leather in order to account for the outer perimeter of the sequin. Pull your thread through, pick up your sequin, and 1 size 15 bead. I usually use a color which works well with the sequin I'm applying. Slide the sequin in the 15 down into place and go back through the sequin. The 15 is going to hold that sequin in place. When you pull down, pull directly down rather than on an angle. This will also help prevent breakage of the thread. There you've attached 1 sequin. Now move on to your next sequin. Again, be sure to account for the space that you're going to need between the sequins. If you come up right next to the previous sequin, they're going to be overlapping. Now we're going to use a size 3mm sequin. Again, pick up your sequin and a size 15 bead. Slide the sequin and the bead down to the leather and go back through the sequin to the back side. As I mentioned before, I usually attach the sequins in a free-form manner. Often I'll spiral the sequins to create an organic feel which looks like stems and vines around the flowers. Now that you've finished the flower and sequin embroidery, we're ready to attach the thong and also the loop that it will go through. Let's start by adding the loop through which the thong will be threaded. You'll find in your instructions a basic template for this loop. Once you've cut the loop out, we're ready to attach it. For this part, you'll want to switch over to a size 12 Glover's needle. Double thread this needle with the nylon thread which best matches the leather you're working with. Then tie a basic knot at the end of the threads. Come in and cut the tail off about 1/4 inch from the knot. Now we're ready to stitch the loop in place. Position it so it's centered over the point at the bottom of the bag and so that it extends about 3/4 inch from that bottom point. Holding all 3 layers together, the pouch and the 2 layers of the loop, come up through the leather from the back side. We're going to attach this loop by doing a crisscross stitch. We'll want to reinforce this stitch a couple of times because it will be a stress point. And one more time. Now work in the opposite direction to finish the other line of the X. Using a wax thread will help your thread move more smoothly through the leather and will also avoid any problems with knots. We're going to reinforce this one more time. And then you've made a very well reinforced X, which is going to hold this in place. You're going to want to come to the back side at this point. Now come to the back side and do a double half hitch to finish off your thread. Cut the thread, leaving about a 1/4 inch tail. Now, using your sewing shears, cut the tails from the loop even with the edge of the pouch. Now we're ready to attach the thong. It's going to be attached on the inside of the pouch flap. You want to make sure that it extends up at least about 1 inch from the edge. If you stitch it too close, you run the risk of the leather ripping out. Just as we did before, you're going to come up from the back side and do an X-shaped stitch. We're also going to reinforce this one a couple of times because, again, like the loop, the thong is going to be a stress point. When attaching the thong, don't worry so much about the shape of your X, as we're going to cover this with one of the beaded flowers. Once you've completed your X, go back over to the back side and again tie a double half hitch just to finish off your threads. In order to cover up this X here and also add a decorative touch to the flap, we're going to stitch another flower just the way we did before. Begin by positioning the lentil bead right in place. Make sure you leave enough of an edge that when you do the flower petals, they're not going to extend all the way to the edge of the leather. Coming up from the back side, again using the fire line, go through the lentil bead 3 times before you begin your flower. Flowers are going to be done exactly the way we had done them before on the back side of the pouch. The only difference is you're going to be stitching through thong at this time. If you have trouble getting through both the layers because you have a layer of leather and a layer of thong, you can switch over to a size 12 English beading needle. These are usually easier to work with, and they will go through a size 15 bead. Now we've finished the flower on the pouch flap. We're ready to move on to gluing the lining inside. Before gluing the lining in place, I like to put a thread into the pouch so that you won't see the knots from the thread. Double thread onto a size 10 Glover's needle, about 10 feet of nylon thread in a color which matches your pouch. With the double threaded needle, come through the outer portion of the bag, the outer layer, right at the tip on the bottom, and pull your thread all the way through. This thread was knotted just as before, with a small knot leaving about 1/4 inch tail. Now we're ready to glue the lining in place. Rather than cutting out the lining and try to match it up with the edges of the outside of the pouch, I prefer to put the glue along the outer edge, stick it to the lining fabric, and then cut away so the edges are lined up perfectly. You're going to want to do this on a piece of scrap paper so that you don't get glue onto your leather backing. Take a little bit of glue on a toothpick and spread it along the edge. You can go right up to the edge, but make sure it's not a thick layer, as it'll smush out when you attach the front to the back. We're going to be stitching the layers together as well, so the glue is simply to hold it in place before we do that. Once you've spread glue all the way around the edge, you're going to turn it over and stick the pouch to the suede lining. You're going to want to let this dry for about 10 minutes before you come in and cut along the edge. Both the front and the back side of the pouch with the flap have been glued down to the lining fabric. We're going to come in now with a pair of sewing shears and cut around the edges. Be sure to cut right in line so that your edges are lined up neatly and evenly. If the glue starts to come unpeeled, don't worry about it, because as I mentioned before, these layers are going to be stitched together. The first row of stitching we're going to do to stitch the two pieces together is along the top side of the front side of the pouch. You can pry back the 2 layers of leather, and using a double thread and a size 10 Glover's needle, come up through the leather. Make sure you put a little knot in there and about 1/4 inch tail. Push the tail down into place, and we're going to whip stitch along the edge. This is a great place to start because it gives you an opportunity to practice this whip stitching in a place on the pouch where you're not going to see a whole lot of the stitch work because the flap will come over this portion of the pouch. I usually space my stitches about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch apart. It does take some degree of practice to get these looking really neat. If you're concerned about getting them exactly right, you may want to practice with a couple pieces of scrap leather before you move to your pouch. Continue stitching all the way across, just using the simple whip stitching. Once we get to the other side, we're going to knot off this thread. I'll show you that when we get there. Once you've stitched all the way across the top of the front side of the pouch, you're ready to knot off your thread. I like to knot off in a way where you can't see any of the tails. So what I'm going to do is come back around one more time and just go through the lining fabric so that I'm coming out the edge between the lining and the front side of the pouch. Now separate the two pieces and reach in there and catch one of the threads. This will make a loop, and you can put your needle through that loop to make a half hitch. Again, do a second half hitch just to reinforce that. Come in with your scissors and snip, leaving about a 1/4 inch tail. You can then push this tail to the inside, and there'll be no tail showing on the outside of your pouch. Now we're ready to stitch the entire pouch together. We're going to go back to that thread that you added in before you glued the lining onto the back side and flap. What I'm going to do is with each whip stitch, I'm going to pick up one size 11 bead. These size 11 beads will fit easily over the 10 Glover's needles. This is going to be the most difficult part of the stitching because you're stitching through at least 4 layers and sometimes more of the leather. Try to space your stitches evenly like before and just take your time. There's no rush, and if you're slow with this, you can have a little bit more control over the stitching. You're going to flip each bead to the outside as you stitch it in place. Do double check to make sure that you're coming through all 4 layers of leather by flipping over to the other side. You want to make sure you've caught the leather on both sides. Continue stitching in this manner all the way around the edge. You're going to come up along this edge here, attaching the 2 layers together, all the way up and around the flap, and then back down this edge, attaching these 2 layers together until you get to the bottom point where you began. Once I get back to where I started, I usually go back through one of the beads again, and we're just going to tie a double half hitch to finish off the thread. There's one, and a second one is 2. Now if we were just to cut this right here, we'd have a tail unless we cut it very close, and then you run the risk of the knot coming undone. So what we're going to do is actually pass the needle in between the layers of leather and come out slightly further up over there. Pull your tail all the way through, and this way there's a hidden tail between the knot and where you cut off. Come in with your small embroidery scissors and cut closely. Now you've finished your pouch. It's completely lined. The edge has been finished with size 11 beads. It's fully embroidered, and you're ready to go. There's a couple options for your thong. You can simply feed the thong through the loop that you've made on here and tie a knot. The other option is to actually wrap the thong entirely around the pouch before coming through and tying a knot. You can cut any additional length of thong that you're not going to use. I usually cut on a diagonal. If you do it this way, you're going to have a piece of thong wrapped around your pouch. If you do it the other way, the back side will be entirely exposed. Here's your finished pouch. I hope you enjoyed making your pouch today and learned some new great techniques for bead embroidery on leather. It's a great accessory for any piece of jewelry and a fabulous place to store any of your treasures.